Welcome to this course, Biosystems Analysis and Modeling. In this introductory video, we will be introducing basic concepts you will need to develop mathematical models of a variety of biological and ecological systems. In later course modules, we will explore various ways to represent systems, to describe systems mathematically, and to analyze systems through the lens of mathematical models. For this introductory module, we have three primary learning objectives. First, upon completing this module, you should be able to identify key elements and relationships in a system. Second, you should have a basic understanding of what is meant by the term model in the context of mathematical analysis. Finally, you should be able to highlight key variables describing a system and the relationships between those variables by diagramming a conceptual model of the system. In order to complete this module, you will need a pencil and a clean sheet of paper. In later modules, we'll be doing some programming to implement our models, but for this module, we'll stick with paper and pencil. Let's get started on some material. The first question we will ask is, what is a model? Within the context of mathematical analysis, the term modeling has some specific meanings, and we want to be sure to share a common vocabulary around modeling throughout this course. In your mind, what do you think of when you think of a mathematical model? Perhaps this term conjures up an equation relating one variable to another. For example, relating crop yield as a function of fertilizer and application rates. Or perhaps your idea of a model takes the form of a computer program that takes some data input and produces an output. Both are examples of models, and we'll be looking into these and other forms as we move throughout the course. Before we dive into models per se, though, let's talk a little about a system, some slice of reality for which we might want to analyze with a model. For example, imagine you are designing or managing an aquaponics facility. Aquaponics is the co-production of vegetables and other plant-based products in combination with fish production, generally in closed-loop systems where water is circulated between fish tanks to plant production to take advantage of nutrient recycling between these two subsystems. Understanding the relationship between the various components of the system is critical for system design and optimizing operations. The basic idea of a systems model is pretty straightforward. We want to start with a question about some slice of reality that we are interested in. Modeling efforts should always start with being clear about what question they are trying to answer. For example, for an aquaponics system, our question might be, how do I maximize fish production while minimizing fertilizer costs? Or, how much vegetable production is needed to absorb all of the waste nutrients generated by the fish? To answer these questions, we need to understand the relationships between these variables and capture these relationships in mathematical forms. The first step in this process involves simplifying the system of interest. We want to focus on the aspect of a system that are relevant and important to the question we are trying to answer. For the aquaponics system, this suggests that we may want to simplify the system down to just two components, plants and fish, and focus on looking at the interactions between these components, particularly those related to nutrient recycling, and ignore those system elements that are not relevant to our questions. The next step in modeling is to describe these components and relationships mathematically. In this example, we use differential equations to describe how the two populations, plant and fish, change through time. In other examples, we will use algebraic equations to capture these relationships. Let's review some key points we want to keep in mind related to modeling. First, all models, no matter how complex, are simplifications of reality, and as a result, never capture perfectly the reality we're trying to model. Therefore, we can unequivocally state that in some sense, all models are wrong. However, that's not the end of the story. Even though models are by necessity imperfect representations of reality, many models are nonetheless very useful. A good model doesn't have to be perfect, but it does need to be well grounded in data and understanding of the system, and it needs to capture key relationships relevant to the question being asked. I also want to emphasize the process of modeling. First, we start with a question about a slice of reality. Second, we simplify our conceptualization of the system. focusing on key elements and relationships controlling system behavior vis-a-vis your question. Third, we cast this simplified system conceptualization into a mathematical form. And finally, we solve the resulting model, generally using some sort of computation. Let's take a look at a simple example, examining water storage in a reservoir. Our question might be along the lines of, what reservoir volumes can we expect to see over the course of a year based on incoming flows from an upstream river and reservoir outflow rates? Or, what reservoir release schedule would provide sufficient downstream flow during later summer months to provide suitable conditions for endangered salmonid stocks while minimizing flooding in winter? Let's take a look at a simple example examining water storage in a reservoir. Our question might be along the lines of, what reservoir volumes can we expect to see over the course of a year based on incoming flows from an upstream river and reservoir outflow rates? Or, what reservoir release schedule would provide sufficient downstream flow during later summer to provide suitable conditions for endangered salmonid stocks while minimizing flooding in winter? From a systems perspective, we could represent this system as a stock of water in the reservoir affected by two flows, depicted by the inflow and the outflow valves on the figure. Additional elements we might want to consider are influences that affect the stocks and flows. It is also helpful to think about a system's boundary that defines what is in and what is external to our system representation. We can apply a mass balance to the stocks in this system, which is conveniently described by a differential equation relating the rate of change in reservoir volume to inflow and outflow rates. Solving, by integrating this equation through time, will allow us to predict the dynamic reservoir volume over time that would result from different inflow and outflow regimes. Next, let's expand our model to include multiple inflows and outflows. Specifically, we will expand our conceptual model to include an additional input from precipitation falling onto the reservoir surface and evaporation from that reservoir surface. Our mathematical model, still based on maintaining a mass balance on the reservoir stock, is adjusted to reflect new flows in the model. We note here, from the point of view of managing the system, reservoir volumes can be adjusted either by changing inflows, changing outflows, or both. Next, let's look at a very different system. Imagine we are managing a small woodlot and are trying to understand the trade-offs associated with either harvesting trees or allowing them to continue to grow. A simplification of the system is shown here. We include two stocks in this conceptualization, one for wood living in trees, representing available biomass in the woodlot, and one for an on-site inventory of harvested lumber. These two stocks are connected via logging activities. As harvest occurs, wood is transferred from the wood and living trees pool to the lumber inventory pool. Additional flows influence system dynamics, including tree growth, contributing new wood to the system, losses due to tree mortality, and losses from the lumber inventory pool due to lumber sales. Again, we can represent this system mathematically using a differential equation-based approach with an equation describing the dynamics of each pool, capturing the various flows contributing to or removing from each stock. Don't worry too much about the details at this point. That'll be coming in later modules. One interesting outcome of systems with multiple interacting stocks and flows is that the stocks in these systems generally change slowly compared to the flows, and therefore tend to buffer or stabilize the system. Complexity tends to promote stability. This is useful to keep in mind when designing systems. Extremely simple, disconnected designs tend to be unstable. Introducing connectivity into a system generally makes a design more stable. Ecosystems have figured this out, and ecosystems that are greatly simplified tend to fail as a design. Biocomplexity, on the other hand, tends to promote stability in the designed ecosystem. As we will see, robust system designs balance simplicity, which tends to minimize costs, with self-regulating complexity, which tends to promote system stability. So far, we have looked at some simple systems and described, in very general terms, what a model of such a system might look like. Let's take a quick look at a few more examples of conceptual models that could be translated into mathematical models using a similar approach to the systems we've looked at so far. In this example, we conceptualize a wetland as a set of stocks and flows. Can you identify the stocks in the system? What about the flows? To develop the math for this model, we would write down a differential equation capturing the mass balance for each stock, reflecting the inflows and outflows, and then integrate those equations. Here is a very generalized conceptual model of an aquatic system. Again, we represent the system as a series of stocks, representing the things we want to keep track of in the system, and flows, representing exchanges of material and/or energy between stocks. In this figure, we also show a system boundary and exogenous or external sources and sinks of material or energy across the system's boundary. These are useful concepts for representing systems, and we will formalize these concepts as we go throughout the course. Here is a conceptual model of a very different type of system, a life insurance company. Note the structural similarity to the previous conceptual models, very similar to the stock and flow concept. This approach is general and can be applied to a wide variety of systems. Let's do an exercise. Think of a system of interest to you and with which you have familiarity with. What are some of the key elements of this system? What are some stocks in the system? Remember, stocks generally represent elements of a system that you want to track a quantity of. What about the flows? These generally represent a process that moves material or energy between stocks. For example, suppose our question deals with water use by a tree used in a phytoremediation project. To model this as a system, we might consider stocks of water stored in various parts of the system: soil water, water stored in the root system, in the tree trunk, in the leaves, and the process or flows that move water between these stocks or across the system's boundary, such as root water uptake, movement of water through the tree, and losses to the atmosphere from transpiration from leaf surfaces. Many other examples exist. Everything is a system. Let's do an example. The goal is to develop a conceptual representation expressed as a diagram, similar to some of the examples we've seen previously. Let's start with a simple system describing plant water use. Taking a very coarse conceptual view, water enters a plant primarily through root uptake of water stored in the soil, which is replenished by precipitation. Water is stored in the plant and is lost from the plant via transpiration, the loss of water through the leaf surfaces to the atmosphere. Conceptually, we can represent this as two stocks of water, one in the soil, one in the plant. The level of each stock is controlled by the relevant processes, in this case precipitation, contributing to the water stored in soils, as well as root uptake transferring water from the soil to the plant, and transpiration, removing water from the plant. Now it's your turn. Imagine a system of interest. Identify 2 or 3 stocks important to this system and write them down on a piece of paper, each in its own box. Then consider relevant processes that connect or control those stocks. These often take the form of flows of material, energy, or information in your system. Indicate the connections or relationships between your stocks and processes. Repeat this exercise a couple of times with different systems until you feel comfortable going from reality to a conceptual simplification that captures key aspects of the system of interest. You may want to pause the video while completing this exercise. So, to recap, in this session, we've been introduced to the idea of taking a slice of reality within the context of a question we are trying to answer and simplifying that slice of reality into a conceptual and ultimately mathematical representation that captures the key systems components and processes that are important to answer the questions you are trying to address. We describe systems as collections of components, often representing stocks of material or energy, and relationships between components, often representing processes or flows, where the behavior of the system is a result of the interactions between different system components. Oftentimes, it is helpful to draw a conceptual diagram of your system. This can be useful for clarifying your thinking, communicating with others, and can be used as a blueprint for developing mathematical descriptions of your system. Key to understanding system behavior is understanding the relationship between different elements of a system and developing mathematical descriptions of these relationships. In upcoming modules, we will dive into the details of this process.